Hey everybody, NecroVMX here, and as you guys know, I recently finished a playthrough of the absolutely amazing masterpiece of a game, CastleVania Symphony of the Night on the Sony PlayStation 1. And yes, you guys can stop asking me if I'm playing it on some other system. It's a PS1 game. Where else would I play it that I could easily do a video of? Come on, give me a break. But anyway, yeah, I finished CastleVania Symphony of the Night recently on PlayStation, and I've gotten some questions, and I've gotten into some discussion with people, and a lot of people seem interested in this. I mentioned a couple of these things during the videos, and people seem very interested in it. A lot of the creatures and bosses and such in the Castlevania games have very interesting origins, whether it's just a name that came from, folklore or mythology, or just the origin of the creatures themselves. Not many people remember this, but Castlevania started as a take on the old Universal horror series of monster movies, and it kind of ballooned up from there. I'm handling Symphony of the Night in this video because that's the one I recently played through, and it's the one that's most fresh in my mind. And in this case, I'm going to take a look at the boss creatures and just sort of give you some notes on each of them and some interesting tidbits about each of them, just like a brief history and whatnot. If you guys like this, I'll do more videos. I'll do it about the lesser enemies, and I'll even expand it out to other Castlevania games if you'd like. But basically in this, I want to talk about the bosses of Castlevania Symphony of the Night, except for Dracula. Maybe I'll do a video just about Dracula. That would be pretty cool. But for now, I'm talking about just the bosses. Now, one thing that somebody mentioned, and that is true, is that the original Castlevania game had 6 levels. If you discount the last boss, Dracula, that's 5 bosses. And the original 5 bosses from the Castlevania game are all in Symphony of the Night. And interestingly enough, those are all in the inverted castle, and they all drop pieces of Dracula. Something that had been a leftover from Castlevania 2, Simon's Quest, the whole pieces of Dracula thing, which I did mention. The original 5 bosses were the Phantom Bat, Queen Medusa, the Mummies, Frankensteins Monster, and Death. And they all reappear here, so let's take a look at each of them in turn. The Phantom Bat in Symphony of the Night became the Darkwing Bat. Now, even though he appears in the inverted castle, he's not much of a threat, and is probably the easiest boss in the whole game. All the bosses are pretty easy, well, except for one. But Darkwing Bat really doesn't even put up much of a fight. He just kind of flaps around, and even though it's a pretty big sprite and you're in a pretty small area, the wings don't even hurt you, so it's pretty hard to get hit. Every once in a while he'll flap his wings and send a gust of wind that'll smash you against a wall, but it's not that big of a deal. I think that the reason he's not much of a threat is because he's based on the Phantom Bat from Castlevania 1, and that was the very first boss you ever fought. Well, I was never sure why they called the bat a Phantom Bat, or why they call it a Darkwing Bat. I mean, to me, I would just call it a Vampire Bat, because it's a game about vampires. For some reason, vampires turning into bats is a common thing in vampire myths, although this just seems to be a giant, disgusting bat, so I don't know. Now, some people have mentioned that when the first Castlevania came out, they were used to games that were much shorter, and when they got to the Phantom Bat, they thought that was Dracula, and they were surprised when the second level started. As a matter of fact, Angry Video Game Nerd, who's currently doing a Castlevania feature of his own, mentioned that he had that sort of similar experience. So that's kind of interesting. The second boss of Castlevania was the Queen Medusa. Now, all throughout the level, and later levels, they had these annoying Medusa heads that would come at you, and then this was the Queen Medusa, but it was still just a head. In Symphony of the Night, like in some other games, Medusa is fully formed. The name Medusa, of course, from ancient Greek myth. Medusa was a gorgon, and she had the power to turn you to stone just by looking at you. For some reason, that wasn't a power that was explored in a lot of the Castlevania games, but she can do it in Symphony of the Night. It doesn't kill you, you can break out of it, but there it is, she can do it. She also wields a sword and a shield, which is, pretty accurate to the original myth of the Medusa. In the original myth, Medusa was killed only by reflecting her stare back at her by using a highly polished shield. You can't do that in the game, you just have to beat the crap out of her, but it's just interesting to mention. Another thing worth mentioning is that is another type of enemy that appears in the Castlevania games a lot called a Gorgon. Remember, Medusa is a Gorgon. While the Gorgons don't look anything like Medusa, they don't look anything like a humanoid at all, they can breathe this sort of dust that turns you into stone, so that sort of makes sense. In some myths, Medusa is seen as hideously ugly, while in other versions of the myth, she's seen as a normal-looking woman, or even a beautiful woman who happens to have snakes for hair. So, you never really know what she's going to look like, and she looks different in each Castlevania game, and that makes sense because she looks different in each telling of the ancient Greek myths. Next up were the mummies, right? Well, there's only one mummy in Castlevania Symphony of the Night, Akhenaten 2. He also appeared in Super Castlevania 4. Remember on the clock tower you fought him? He's pretty easy too, and there's not really much to say about him. Like, while many of the creatures are based on myths and folklore and whatnot, the mummy is straight out of a Universal picture, the Mummy, who was played by Boris Karloff. And there were a bunch of other mummy movies featuring a different mummy, and that one was always wrapped in bandages and going and whatnot. So I guess that's the mummy that these mummies are based off of. Akhenaten 2 is a pretty stock mummy. There's not really much to say about him. Mummies come from the ancient Egyptian practice of mummification, taking corpses and wrapping them in bandages and scrambling their brains and burying them with their organs in jars. For some reason they thought that they would come back and, reclaim their organs, and I don't know what they do after that. I guess go on a rampage, but there you have it. After that was Frankensteins Monster, another from the Universal Pictures, and another one played by Boris Karloff. Usually in Castlevania, people tend to call it Frankenstein, just like in the movies, but of course it's called Frankensteins Monster. In Castlevania Symphony of the Night, they just call it the creature, which I think is great because it never really had a name at all. And putting Frankensteins Monster will just add to the usual confusion. It seems to be based not off of the actual book Frankenstein, but the Universal picture, where Dr. Frankenstein created the creature by stitching together corpses. In the original book, Frankenstein created the monster through an unknown means that was supposed to be using chemicals and such. Mary Shelley didn't want to describe what the process was because she didn't want people to try it. I don't know, people were fucked up back then. They probably would have done it. But anyway, the most common version of Frankenstein's monster that people are used to is from the Universal picture, Boris Karloff with the stitched-together face. So that's what you usually see in Castlevania. You could usually recognize him instantly by the large stitching on his head. In this one, he uses a hammer, and I don't think there's any kind of significance to that. Personally, my favorite Frankenstein monster from the Castlevania games was in the N64 one, because he used a chainsaw. He was actually fucking scary. And then we have Death, also known as the Grim Reaper. Well, there's not really much to say about him. He's the embodiment of death and evil, and kind of comes from the Bible in a way, although it's been romanticized and changed over the years. He's usually depicted as a skeleton in robes, and has a scythe. Now, I don't know where this image came from exactly. I think it evolved over time, but you see it in all sorts of horror movies and fantasy stories and folklore and mythology and such. It's a pretty common thing. A lot of people think that it's funny that Death would take orders from Dracula, but if you know the story of Dracula, you know he's the embodiment of evil, and Death, well, he's just looking for souls to harvest, and who's going to do that better for him than Dracula? Anyway, I'm going to go through the rest of the bosses in alphabetical order. We'll start with Beelzebub. Most people think Beelzebub is a name for the devil or Satan, but actually it originally literally means Lord of the Flies, which is why he's a giant rotted corpse and he attacks with flies and worms and such. Kind of makes sense. He was a god of Canaan in the Bible, and there's really not much to say about it. Then we have the zombie trio. We have Zombie Sypha, Zombie Trevor, and Zombie Grant Dynasty. Now, they're all based off of certain people and whatnot, but it doesn't matter. You know them as the characters that fought with Alucard in Castlevania 3, Dracula's Curse. What's interesting is that in the Japanese versions of the game, Trevor Belmont is called Wraith Belmont. And if you beat the game and you look at the times, you can see that it says fake Wraith instead of fake Trevor. Kind of interesting. There's not much really to say about them, except that Sypha will resurrect Trevor if you kill him before her. I guess it's because they were in love. Of course, this isn't the real Sypha and Trevor, so I don't know. Anyway, moving on, we have Cerberus. Well, he's pretty common. Cerberus, or Hellhound as he's called, is a three-headed dog that guards Tartarus, or Hell, in ancient Greek and Roman myths. Not really much to say about him. It's a pretty common stock image. Then we have the Doppelganger. There's actually two Doppelgangers in Symphony of the Night, a Doppelganger 10 and a Doppelganger 40. I think they're both pretty much the same character, just the Doppelganger 40 is more powerful and has new tricks. Doppelganger is a German word that means double, and there's really not much to it. For high-ranking leaders and such in Germany would have a doppelganger, somebody that looked like them but wasn't them. They were kind of a decoy. I think even Hitler had one. Well, anyway, Doppelganger has come to mean something along the lines of something that takes the form of something else and pretends to be it for whatever reason. And a lot of horror movies have stuff like that. Think of like Invasion of the Body Snatchers and things like that. There's not much to say about the Doppelganger. He's an exact clone of Alucard. There actually was a Doppelganger in CastleVania 3, so it sort of makes sense that he'd appear in Symphony of the Night, as Alucard was in both games. The Doppelganger in that game would change characters with you, and that was the best way to beat him, to get him as he changed characters. Well, anyway, this video is getting pretty long, so I'm going to break it right here. I'll see you with the next one. We'll go through the rest of the bosses.